Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are now in the final episode of our series on cultivating chastity. And as with the previous two episodes, we are considering some of the practical wisdom that we can use to be successful in our pursuit of the virtue of chastity. In other words, how we can fulfill our sexuality in marriage successfully. And to finish up, I wanted to consider some of the ways in which we can avoid sabotaging ourselves when we pursue chastity. Because there are so many simple and common ways in which we unthinkingly damage our own chances at successfully finding a spiritually healthy and fruitful marriage. And often, when we're aware of those dangers, we can actually mitigate those to some extent. So let's get right into the list. Number one, you need to deliberately regulate your media consumption. Because what you watch on TV can really mess up your expectations and your desires for relationships. Especially movies and TV. But books and comics and games and internet, those can all have a negative impact as well. Garbage in, garbage out is an expression that we use in programming. That, if you put the wrong inputs into a program, of course you're going to get the wrong outputs. But you know what? It's really true of programming, if you will, our minds as well. When we watch TV, when we watch movies, when we read books, we know it's all fiction. We are aware of that. But even when it's fiction, media does shape us nevertheless. Because mentally, it acts almost like experience. Especially with TV and movies. It's what we've seen in TVs and movies is what we've literally seen happening to other people, even though we know it's fiction. And that does shape our expectations and our desires in some profound ways. And it makes us extremely vulnerable to media influence, which is used against us. C.S. Lewis talks about this in the Screwtape Letters. When Screwtape's he's writing to Wormwood, the demon who he's training, as it were. And he's talking about the work that the demons do in order to mess us up on this score. So Lewis writes, "It is the business of these great masters to produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual taste. This they do by working through the small circle of popular artists, dressmakers, actresses, and advertisers who determine the fashionable type. The aim is to guide each sex away from those members of the other with whom spiritually helpful, happy, and fertile marriages are most likely." And that is very much the case today. Screwtape Letters is a great book, period. Very prophetic in a lot of ways. But this one in particular, it's very much the case today, more so than when Lewis wrote this, simply because media technology has advanced so much since then. Just pause and consider for a moment all the romantic liaisons that you've seen on television and in movies, and step back and soberly assess exactly how many of those characters who are supposed to be attractive would actually make a good spouse from a Christian perspective. Not a whole lot of them. Consider what kind of traits are presented to you as attractive, as this is what's supposed to be what you are supposed to look for in a wife or in a husband or in a boyfriend or in a girlfriend. And ask yourself whether those traits are going to do you any good in the long run in a marriage, in a faithful marriage. And the reality is that we are all being trained to desire men and women who are simply not good for us. And it's impossible to avoid this completely, okay? You could run away to a monastery, but that's not going to help you find a spouse. So in the short term, we are stuck with the culture that we have. We can't excise ourselves from that culture. We have to live in it, and we can't change it in the short term. But what you can do is balance it out. You can limit the amounts and the kinds of television and movies that you watch. And you can spend more time with books or movies that were created in different eras than our own. Reading a Jane Austen novel, that is going to shape a woman's sense of attraction much differently than a TV show on the CW. So be aware of that. Use it to your advantage. Help yourself to become attracted to the right kind of person. It's going to broaden your dating pool a lot more than you might think, and it's going to keep you away from some folks who would be utterly poisonous to you. Number 2, and don't forget when I gave you this one, but you should get in shape and you should stay in shape. And again, I'm not trying to tempt anyone to a negative body image here. The goal is not trying to look like actors and models, right? And if you're watching this on YouTube, obviously I have no business telling anybody to try to do that. But I mean, looking that way is a full-time job, right? But there is no world in which looks don't matter, and where it's only what's on the inside that counts. And yeah, that's what we're all told as kids, but it's not true. God created our bodies for a reason, and if looks had absolutely zero relevance, we wouldn't have looks in the first place. So, and more than that, I mean, we do live in a particularly shallow culture in this respect. Looks carry a lot more weight than they should. And as much as I would like to say, oh, well, you just need to find somebody who isn't shallow, well, you know what? Things are already hard enough when it comes to finding a good spouse. Why deliberately make it harder on yourself by restricting yourself to people who aren't going to be offended by ugliness? Okay? The easier that you can make it on others to find you attractive, the better off you are going to be. The easier it's going to be to find people willing to enter into relationships with you. And this is especially true for the guys. And yeah, maybe that's not fair, but it is what it is. Most men can find physical things to appreciate about most women, but the converse is not really true. Not too long ago, this is really interesting. There was I think it was OkCupid, but in any case, there was one of the major dating sites. They released data about their users and how they sampled pictures of the opposite sex and marked each one as being above average or below average. And when men were rating pictures of women, they would rate about half the women as above average and half as below, which is exactly what you expect. That's what an average is. Women, on the other hand, they rated 80% of the men as below average. 80% below average. Okay, so yeah, I mean that's guys, that's not fair. But you can't make life fair. You can only do the best you can with what you've got. So work on becoming more physically attractive. You can join a sport. That is a good way to stay in shape. If you're like me and you're not exactly athletically inclined, you know what? At least lift weights. At least go for walks. At least do some kind of cardio. Anybody can do those things. You'll look better. You'll be stronger, and more importantly, you're going to feel better about yourself. You're going to become more used to carrying strength with you. You're going to become more confident. And those are all very, very valuable things to have when you're looking for a spouse. And again, just make sure that you balance this out with everything else in your life. Just because it's important, and it is important, that doesn't mean it's something I want to get obsessed with, right? If you're tempted to get obsessive over this, and some people are tempted to that, allow me to put it in perspective for you. Staying healthy, it is just the slowest way to die. And staying in shape is just the slowest way of becoming ugly. We are mortals. We live in a fallen world. So you will get wrinkles. Your hair will fall out. It'll turn gray if you keep it. Things will start sagging. You won't be able to maintain muscle mass and so forth. And you don't want either spouse to be expecting otherwise. We have to be realistic about what till death do us part really means. But that said, sexual attraction makes it a lot easier to find a spouse in the first place, and it makes it a lot easier to develop good habits early on in the relationship by priming the pump of loving kindness. And it's a lot easier to remain faithful as you grow older later on if you're actually working to keep yourselves keeping in reasonable shape. And if that's there, if you have that love for one another, if you have that regard for one another, that you do actually think that your looks are important and that you care about the way they see you, if you have that care there, in the long run, marriage goggles are going to take care of a lot of the growing old aspects of marriage. You tend to remember your spouse as they were when you were younger. You don't see all the wrinkles, okay? You don't see all the gray hair the same way that a stranger would. And that's a very good, helpful thing in the long run, because we are all going to grow old. But you know what? Taking care of yourselves physically, that is a great gift that you can give to one another. And it makes it a lot easier in the beginning. Number 3, be realistic about the kind of man or woman that you can attract. Okay, in other words, don't expect to find a husband who looks like Chris Hemsworth unless you look like Scarlett Johansson, and vice versa. People sabotage themselves with those kinds of expectations all the time. And this is where the numbers can actually be somewhat useful, like saying, he's a 9 or she's a 7 or what have you. And a lot of people complain about numbering people according to how attractive they are. But most of those are complaints based on the misconception that the number represents your value as a human being, okay? And it doesn't, okay? You're more than whether or not you're attracted to somebody else. The number is really more akin to an estimate, and a loose estimate at that, of other people's demand for men and women who bring to the table what you have to offer. Okay, and whether that's for marriage or whether that's just for sex, and people do evaluate those two goals differently. So be careful of numbering yourself or others according to the wrong scale there. But all that being said, it can actually be useful, again, as long as you don't become obsessive over it. What I mean by that is, if you're a 5, don't think that the world owes you a 10. It doesn't. And if you consistently find yourself believing that the people who are actually interested in you are always beneath you, they're too unattractive, and the kind of people that you are interested in, that you do find attractive, are consistently uninterested in you, well, there's a very, very good chance that you are overestimating yourself in your own attractiveness. And if that's the position you're in, you have 2 choices. You need to either become more attractive yourself, or you need to set your sights lower. And those are the realistic choices there. And yeah, be realistic about your prospects, not resentful about them. Because you know what? At the end of the day, below average people can have very happy and satisfying marriages. And it's the resentment and it is the entitlement that sabotage our ability to find happiness in those kinds of situations. So be realistic about yourself. Be realistic about the people that you're interested in. Number 4, remember that men and women are different. Which, yeah, that's one of those things that's completely obvious, but we're trained to think and to act as though that's not true. So even when we know that we're different, we still find ourselves acting as though we're the same, and so we have to consciously consider some of those differences because of the bad feminist training that we've all received. And we sabotage ourselves when we forget this for a number of reasons, but the big one is this. Just because there's something that you're looking for in the opposite sex, and that's really important to you, that you find really attractive, it does not mean that the opposite sex is going to find that same feature attractive in you. Okay. For example, academic and career accomplishment is seen differently between the 2 sexes. In general, women are hypergamous, meaning that they want to marry up. Women tend to be attracted to men who are taller than them, men who are stronger than them, who earn more money, and in general who are just more accomplished than they are. And so they find academic and career accomplishments attractive in men. However, a lot of women make a mistake when they assume that the same holds true in reverse, that men find their own career and academic accomplishments attractive. But in general, we don't. Those things don't make women more attractive in our eyes, generally speaking. It's not a bad thing, but it's just kind of irrelevant to us for the most part. And you wind up with, a lot of women who with really high-paying jobs or with PhDs who naturally they don't want to settle for a man with anything less, who earns any less than they do or has, less than a PhD. And that's really problematic for them in the long run because that really, really shrinks your dating pool if that's what you're looking for. And at the same time, your own accomplishments, they're shrinking your dating pool, but they're not making you more attractive to most men. Even men with PhDs, even men with high-paying careers. I mean, you don't want a big intelligence gap in a marriage because that makes it hard to meaningfully communicate with one another. But men don't care about your credentials. We can tell whether you're in the same ballpark, intellectually speaking, just by having a conversation. And another example for the men this time, submissiveness. In general, men find submissive behavior attractive in women, which makes sense because that is part of God's design for marriage. But there are a lot of men who make the mistake of assuming that women are the same way, that they're going to find submissive behavior attractive in men. And so they find themselves acting that way towards women in their lives, which means that they also find themselves in the friend zone a lot. A lot of men end up being overly passive around women in relationships, in romantic relationships, and in friendships. And they end up continually looking to their girlfriend or their wife or their best friend for approval, which that is a big turnoff for women. Generally, within reason, you're better off taking the initiative, even if it's not what they would have chosen. In other words, if you're planning a date, you're better off choosing a movie or a restaurant or whatever that she really wasn't that interested in than you would be effectively forcing them to arrange everything by themselves by making sure that they approve of every single little detail beforehand. Okay, and again, I'm not saying ignore women's preferences. You shouldn't do that. I'm saying take the initiative, even knowing that you are going to make mistakes sometimes, and then learn from the mistakes. But it's okay to make mistakes. Life goes on. And this is there are a lot of different ways that we make these mistakes here, and it is way too big of a topic to explore in depth here, but it's something to keep in mind. Again, conform to your gender. For the most part, that's a very, very helpful thing. Number 5, don't fornicate. And, how do you stay chaste? Well, don't be unchaste. Thanks, Matt. That's exactly the kind of brilliance we come to this channel for. But no, remember that chastity is more than just don't fornicate, right? It's a disposition towards fulfilling your sexuality in marriage and family. But there is a flip side to that. And that is that when we fornicate, there's more going on than just a momentary moral lapse. It makes marriage harder for us than it otherwise would be. And this one is especially true for women. Again, might not be fair, but life is not fair, and you need to play the hand that you've been dealt. The more you fornicate, the more you sabotage your future prospects for marriage. And note, I did not say it makes marriage impossible. I said it makes it harder than it otherwise would be. Past sin is not a reason for despair. The wise person is always going to do the best with what they have. But a wise person is also going to try very hard to avoid sin and avoid sabotaging themselves and squandering what they have in the first place. So yeah, you do need to consider your partner's sexual history. Men in particular need to pay attention to this. Fornication is not any more or less sinful for men versus women or for women versus men, but the earthly consequences are different. And men, you already know this instinctively. Yeah, I don't really have to tell you this. But there are a lot of people who will try to shame you for knowing it. Don't let them. The risk of divorce is about 50%. Between 60 and 80% of divorces are unilaterally carried out by wives against their husbands. And the legal consequences of divorce in America are very, very much stacked against men. And so it makes sense to reduce your risk as much as possible. And you know what? If your bride is a virgin, the risk of divorce in the first 5 years is only 5%. If she slept with one other person, or one person before marriage, that quadruples to about 20% risk in the first 5 years. And more than one, you get to about 25%. And then by the time you're in double digits, it's rising over 30% risk of divorce in the first 5 years. A while back there was this kerfuffle about the whole men prefer debt-free versions without tattoos thing. And so that there were a ton of Christian women and white knights who were saying, how dare you say that? But you know what? It's true. It's true whether you like it or not. And you have to adapt yourself to that reality. And you need to be realistic too. And again, I'm speaking to the men here in particular. Virginity is a lot rarer than it should be in young women, and which is another good reason to consider marriage at a younger age than you otherwise would. But you know what? Maybe that's not an option for you. And maybe you're going to need to roll the dice regardless, and that's fine. That's okay. You can't hide from risk altogether in your life. But don't be blind about the implications. Do look for signs of repentance in situations like that. And again, don't listen to all the fools out there who are going to tell you that you have a moral obligation to be blind or otherwise shame you into ignoring sexual history. They're the ones who are wrong, not you. Don't let them shame you into sabotaging yourself. And number 6, this is our last one. Don't despair. Don't despair. Because as we've gone through the series, there have been no lack of complaints about our culture, about the contemporary church, about our laws, our customs, about men these days, or about women these days. And that's because there's no shortage of problems with all of these things in our society. But there is one thing that is far more destructive to chastity than all of those things combined. And that is when Christians react to these problems with despair. And a lot of people are waking up to these problems now, but so many of them are overawed by the enormity of the problems that they just give up. You know, you hear people saying, oh, there's no point getting married because your wife is just going to divorce you and take your kids anyway. Just give up. Give up now. Or there's no point getting married because men are toxic and we're unreliable and callous, so just give up now. And that's the challenge with presenting these kinds of lists, is that a lot of people will hear all these things and realize that, wow, you know, I have failed some of these, which, you know what, almost everybody has, by the way. And then because they failed in some of these, that they give up. I can't do all this. It's too hard. I just quit. Well, you know what, maybe you can't do all these things, but you know what, you can do some of them. Everybody can do some of these things. And for Christians struggling with sexual immorality, you don't have the moral option of quitting. Okay, marriage is what Paul prescribed for your situation. And if you haven't been called to celibacy, then you should be aiming for marriage as best you can. And yeah, the deck is stacked against us. And yeah, life is unfair. And yes, our society is ridiculously corrupt. And yes, we have all added to those problems by making our own mistakes. We all have. But we can suffer all things through him who strengthens us. We may succeed or we may fail. And yeah, you can do every last thing on this list and still not find a spouse. This is about maximizing your chances, not finding some kind of guarantee. There is no sure and certain flowchart to success in this sorts of things. But even struggling and failing is infinitely more satisfying than surrendering and going your own way to carve out some small piece of hedonism for yourself, where the challenges of life just won't reach you anymore. Which is why I wanted to close by, considering the last verse of Luther's famous hymn, Mighty Fortress, which is about resisting the devils that fill our world. And take they our life, goods, fame, child, and wife. Let these all be gone. They yet have nothing won. The kingdom ours remaineth. And yeah, all these things are on the line in this struggle. And maybe we really will lose them. That is possible. Or maybe we'll never be able to gain these things in the first place. That is possible. We run that risk. But Jesus Christ has already won the victory for us, even if we fail. The only way that we can truly be defeated by Satan is by surrendering to him. So if this seems too daunting, if you're overawed with this, if you failed time and again in this struggle, you stagger to your feet, you brush yourself off, and you get back in the fight. Because you can't ignore your callings just because they're hard. And that is where we're going to close this subject. So thank you very much for watching and for sticking with this to the end. I know this was a particularly long series. But if you've gotten anything out of it, or you know people who could make use of it, you know what? Share the videos. Pass them around so that they can benefit too. And you can also subscribe to the channel, because we will have more series on other topics in the future. After all, the devil never sleeps, and so the Reformation never ends.